Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Micetopia for the Nintendo Switch. And though this game is actually genre-wise somewhat related to a Metroid-Vania, it's a bit more of Metroid-Vania inspired and leans a bit more toward platforming adventure than a true Metroid-Vania. So if you are a fan of the hardcore Metroid-Vanias out there, don't get your hopes up too terribly high. As we might expect from a platformer though, the story is fairly light. Looking at Micetopia, the utopia for mice, apparently some dark evil has taken place and left all of the villagers, save for the village elder, to be whisked away into the bowels of some dark cavern. And using your trusty sword, you'll have to explore the game's maps to rescue villagers in order to be able to upgrade your character and unlock new skills. New skills in Micetopia might include the ever-popular double jump or even a dodge roll. But as you navigate your way through caverns and even forests, you'll not only face the game's standard and somewhat limited portfolio of minions, but you'll also encounter a few unique bosses. But it's not defeating the bosses that will gain you skills, it's actually rescuing the villagers that those bosses protect. And so, like a true Micetopian hero, the game isn't balanced around the idea of achieving ultimate power, it's about protecting the weak. But getting back to one of the more unique areas of the game, and one of the things that does separate it from a true Metroidvania, is the fact that the game doesn't have one giant unified map, it actually has two. And so earlier in the game, and for arguably most of the game, you'll be playing through the caverns, but after you reach a certain point, you'll actually have a change of scenery, a change of enemies, and a definite upgrade in difficulty as you play through the game's second map that's involved in the fantasy-style forest. And as you're only able to unlock a very small amount of skills, one of the ways that you can keep up with the game's difficulty, not only through improving your own skills as a platforming gamer, is actually by upgrading your character. After you rescue the first character in the game's blacksmith, you can bring him a certain number of these little glowing gobstoppers and he can use them to upgrade your weapon. But for gamers like myself that tend to be a bit more on the damage sponge side, later in game you can also upgrade your health bar. Though do expect these costs to get fairly high. Every single enemy in the game, except for some reason, bats, will drop between 1 and 2 of these little green glowing orbs, and every pot you break also has the opportunity to drop up to 2 orbs. And so as you can imagine, with between 1 and 3 minions in every single map room, it might take you a while to grab the requisite 3, 5, and 900 green orbs to get each of the subsequent upgrades for your sword or for your health bar. But as an RPG gamer from birth, if you are given to grinding like I am, you can just find a couple of rooms in one of the caves and slay the enemies, walk out, walk right back in, and farm pretty quickly. And while normally I hate room-based platformers that have instant respawn for random mobs, in a game with mob drop currency, it really comes in handy. But moving on to the game's visuals and audio, Micetopia is a really cute pixel art game, and the graphics are done really, really well, especially considering the bosses and the boss fights. And while I would like to praise the sum total of the environments in the game, I definitely preferred the pixel work in the cave area as opposed to the forest. And that's specifically because the artwork in the forest didn't really let you know visually that there was a cap to each of the rooms, and it did feel like your jumping was quite limited. Otherwise, the audio package of the game is also really respectable and very high quality, if not a little bit repetitive. Because if you're not a particularly gifted platforming adventure gamer, you might be stuck in particular sections pretty often until you manage to move past. And that might get you some extra exposure to the game's audio. But that subtle critique does bring us to the game's critiques in general. And first and foremost would have to be, again, Micetopia's genre. It's not a true Metroidvania for several reasons. And primarily one of those being that the entire game isn't played out in one large scaling unlockable map. The map is large and it does have rooms that connect, but it would be a bit of a stretch to call it an interconnected map, especially because 2 distinct areas are completely separate. And while there are certain skills that you can gain to help you push further in that initial map area, none of those skills are particularly necessary, except for maybe the dodge roll, the later you get into game. And in that sense, the true genre expectations might be a lot closer to an adventure-style platformer than what anyone would expect from a Metroidvania. And this is especially when you start to consider the RPG elements of using currency to upgrade your weapons and health. Another critique that might be more or less impactful on certain players will be the fact that the enemy portfolio is rather limited. In each of the game's 2 areas, besides the bosses of course, there's only about 3, maybe 4 different mobs that will be consistent throughout that entire map. And while they do a really good job of spicing up the area and sometimes catching you off guard with their color palette, it does seem like for an adventure that takes more than a few hours, there might be more than 6 enemies. Moving on though, it would be amiss if I didn't reference the boss fights. Boss fights are huge for anyone who's a fan of retro classic or arcade style gaming. They're supposed to create this intense challenge that really gives you the reward payoff of the game. And unfortunately the boss fights in Micetopia really aren't terribly challenging. If you are a complete novice gamer, they might take you a couple tries to memorize their attack patterns or kinda just to finesse your way through the controls to dodge a few attacks. But anyone who's even moderately experienced really won't have that much trouble. And so if you were thinking of downloading Micetopia because you thought Metroid-Vania, big map, huge bosses, that might be a point that might be a little bit disappointing. And so pretty much everything about Micetopia seems to be a little bit more introductory level. So if you're not particularly gifted at Metroidvanias or in boss fights, this one might be one you'd want to put on your list. But there is one final critique that I've reserved to the end, because I know a lot of people out there like to flame me for saying things are too difficult. But when it regards weapon and enemy hitboxes, there are some fine lines that might be okay for the punishing platformer style gamers that anyone else would really not appreciate. And unfortunately, the weapon and enemy hitboxes in Micetopia are one of those things. Watching the gameplay footage already, I'm sure that you've seen that every time you hit an enemy, there's a slight recoil that pushes it just out of range. And because you can't run and slash or stay in forward motion while slashing, it does make engaging enemies quickly a bit of a tightrope. And this may be because you're playing as a tiny mouse with an absolutely tiny sword, but the difference in distance between damaging the enemy and the enemy damaging you on contact is incredibly minute. But like all aspects of gaming, it is regular, it is consistent, and you can learn your way around it. So again, just something to consider before you get into the game. Altogether though, looking at Micetopia as a complete package, I was rather pleased with it and I had a pretty good time, especially considering the sale price, which as I recall was around $1.99. And so depending on your level of gaming experience, it may or may not be something you would really enjoy playing. But anyway, that does about bring us to the end of the review for Micetopia, now on the Nintendo Switch, so if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to give us a like or throw us a comment to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. There are new and unique indie games coming out literally every single day, and there are thousands out there on the eShop alone. So whether it's an easy hard pass or an absolutely unforgettable gem, chances are if it's on the Switch, you're gonna find out about it right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.